After I refused to hand over my share of the family business, my mother called a meeting with lawyers ready to pressure me. But when they laid the papers in front of me, I just smiled and said, "I brought a few guests who have other plans." The room went silent and everything. Hi Reddit, I'm Alex, 42, and I'm here to share a story that's been unraveling in my family for the past year. This isn't some quick, sensational drama. It's a slow burn involving years of manipulation, control, and outright greed, and now it's all coming to a head. To give you some background, our family business is a small chain of hardware stores that my grandparents started back in the 1960s. It's been passed down through the generations, and when my dad died about 10 years ago, ownership went to my mom, Evelyn, my brother Daniel, and me. Mom, Evelyn, is the kind of woman who never takes no for an answer. She's sharp, demanding, and has this uncanny way of twisting any conversation to suit her agenda. She's always been the powerhouse behind the business, but controlling it isn't enough for her. She has to control everyone around her, especially her kids. Daniel, my younger brother by 3 years, has been her favorite for as long as I can remember. He's not particularly skilled or interested in the business. Honestly, he spends most of his time away from the stores, but Mom treats him like the golden son. He's charming when he wants to be, and he's good at playing the role she demands. He's the classic smiling yes man, who never asks too many questions and does what Mom tells him. Me? I've always been more independent. From a young age, I was the one interested in the nuts and bolts of the business. I worked hard, took on responsibility, and even pushed for modernizing things, like introducing better accounting systems and opening up online sales. But none of that sat well with Mom or Daniel. They saw it as rocking the boat and trying to undermine the family legacy. The tension was always there, but it really started to boil over about 2 years ago. Daniel started charging a lot of personal expenses to the company accounts. Trips that had nothing to do with work, dinners with friends, even some luxury items. When I questioned it, Mom brushed it off or said I was overreacting. Whenever I pushed for transparency, she'd get cold and remind me who was really running this business. I tried to be patient, but it became clear that Daniel's behavior was only getting worse, and Mom was enabling it. The last straw came when I discovered some vendor invoices that were suspiciously inflated, and I suspected Daniel was funneling money through fake companies to cover his lifestyle. I brought it up at the board meeting. Mom snapped, accusing me of trying to start drama and dividing the family. Daniel played the victim perfectly, claiming I was jealous and trying to take everything for myself. After that, things between us turned icy. Mom made it clear I wasn't welcome at certain meetings, and Daniel started making decisions without consulting me. I realized that if I didn't stand up now, I'd be pushed out entirely. Last year, I officially asked for an accounting audit and proposed a plan to redistribute some shares to reflect the actual work and investment each of us had put in. Mom refused outright, saying it was disloyal and that the business was a family legacy, not a personal bank account. Daniel backed her up, saying I was being selfish. So I refused to give up my shares or let them be diluted without cause. That's when the real pressure began. Fast forward to last week. I received a formal invitation to a meeting at the company headquarters. When I arrived, the conference room was set up with a long polished table, leather chairs, and that unmistakable scent of expensive coffee and polished wood. Mom was already there, dressed impeccably, with 2 lawyers I'd never met before. Daniel was lounging in a chair, looking far too relaxed for the situation. There was an awkward, forced civility in the air, like everyone was pretending this was a routine business discussion rather than a confrontation that could change everything. Mom started the meeting with her usual calm but firm voice. "Alex, we're here to resolve this matter once and for all. The company needs stability, and it's time for you to accept what's best for the family." One of the lawyers slid a thick folder across the table. "These are the transfer documents for your shares. We ask you to sign today." I looked at the papers carefully. They were designed to strip me of control, handing everything over to Daniel. The fine print was full of legalese about simplification of ownership and avoiding family discord, but everyone there knew it was about Mom and Daniel consolidating power and squeezing me out. I stayed silent for a moment, weighing my words. Then I smiled. Mom's eyes flicked up sharply. "I'm not signing," I said simply. Mom's face tightened. "Alex, you're making a mistake." Before the lawyers could respond, I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a stack of printed documents. I hired an independent investigator, I said, voice steady. What I found was disturbing. I laid the evidence on the table. Detailed financial records showing Daniel's unauthorized expenses, shady vendor deals, and clear signs of embezzlement. The two lawyers exchanged uneasy glances. Daniel's smile faltered. Mom's composure cracked just slightly. She said, "This is baseless." I shook my head. "Not at all. And I brought a few people who will verify everything." The conference room door opened quietly. Two people stepped in, a forensic accountant from a respected firm and a senior representative from one of our largest suppliers, both holding documents and reports backing up my claims. The room went silent. Mom's face lost its color. Daniel looked as if he wanted to disappear. The senior lawyer cleared his throat, looking between Mom, Daniel, and me. "Given these revelations, we should reconsider the approach here." After that meeting, the atmosphere between my family and me shifted in a way I hadn't anticipated. I thought bringing the evidence to light would force them to back down, or at least give us some kind of chance for an honest discussion. Instead, it was like I had lit a fuse, and now the whole family was gearing up for a fight they were determined to win by any means necessary. The days following the meeting were tense. My phone started ringing more often, calls from unknown numbers, silent hang-ups, even a few messages that felt more like warnings than anything else. At first, I tried to brush it off, focusing on my work and making sure my own life stayed steady. But then things at the company began to deteriorate rapidly. Mom summoned me again, this time with a noticeably colder tone. She said, "You're making this personal, Alex. You think you can come in here with your accusations and threaten the family? This company is a legacy, something you're too short-sighted to understand." Daniel was with her, eyes glittering with something I hadn't seen before, a mix of anger and desperation. It was clear they were scared. The more I pushed, the more they doubled down. Soon enough, the board meetings became battlegrounds. Instead of discussing business plans or strategies, every session turned into a hostile interrogation of me. Mom would interrupt my suggestions with sharp remarks. Daniel started showing up with supporters, longtime employees who seemed loyal to him, but not necessarily qualified or interested in the business's success. They whispered behind my back, spread rumors that I was trying to sabotage the company. They painted me as the troublemaker, the one threatening to destroy what our family had built. But it wasn't just professional sabotage. I started noticing things at home. Mom's subtle digs about my lack of commitment became louder and more public. Family gatherings turned into platforms for her to remind everyone, including distant relatives, how I was disloyal and ungrateful. Daniel would smirk in the background, tossing sly comments my way whenever he thought I wasn't paying attention. My closest friends and even some employees began to pull away, afraid to get caught in the crossfire. The legal pressure escalated too. A week after the meeting with the lawyers, I found a formal letter slipped under my door. It was a cease and desist from the company's legal team, demanding that I stop any further investigations and immediately return any confidential documents I had accessed. They warned of severe legal consequences if I didn't comply. It felt like the family was trying to box me in, suffocate me with rules and threats. But I wasn't about to back down. Then came the real turning point. The moment I realized Mom and Daniel weren't just using legal maneuvers, they were ready to play dirty in every way. One afternoon, a close employee I trusted called me, voice trembling. "Alex, I don't know how to say this, but the company's payroll system was hacked. They're trying to make it look like you're responsible for embezzling funds. There are fake transactions, withdrawals traced back to your accounts." I felt my heart sink. It was a clear setup. I went straight to the company's IT department and hired an independent cybersecurity firm to investigate. The results confirmed my worst fears. Someone inside the company, likely with access to upper management tools, was fabricating evidence to frame me. I thought, this is war. Mom refused to meet me after that. I tried calling, texting, even showed up at her office, but she made it clear I was persona non grata. Meanwhile, Daniel started openly mocking me at public events related to the business. At a supplier conference, he called me the brother who's lost his way, accusing me of jeopardizing the future for personal gain. The crowd looked uncomfortable, but no one stepped in. The local press picked up on the family dispute, but the narrative was skewed heavily in Mom and Daniel's favor. They'd spent years building strong community ties, and they spun the story as if I was the black sheep trying to tear the family apart. One night, I received a message from an anonymous source. It was a video, snippets of private conversations from one of our board meetings, edited to make me look like I was threatening employees and trying to sabotage company operations. The source was clear: sign over your shares, or this goes public. I sat staring at the screen, realizing how far they were willing to go. My own family was orchestrating a smear campaign against me. Instead of giving in, I gathered a small team of loyal employees and outside experts. We began documenting everything: every suspicious email, every unexplained financial movement, every shady conversation. I knew I had to prepare for the worst. The final straw came when my bank contacted me about suspicious activity, multiple large withdrawals flagged as unusual. Someone had apparently tried to freeze my personal accounts and even file a lien against my property. It was clear that Mom and Daniel were trying to ruin me financially, to push me into submission by any means necessary. I realized then that this wasn't just a business dispute. It was personal, a battle for control, pride, and revenge. They saw me as a threat to their empire, and they were ready to destroy me to protect it. But I wasn't alone. The people I brought to that first meeting, the forensic accountant and the supplier's representative, they weren't just witnesses, they became allies. We started planning a counterattack, gathering more evidence, and preparing to expose the truth at the next board meeting. Mom and Daniel didn't know what was coming, and neither did I fully. The morning of the big board meeting arrived slower than usual, as if the whole day was holding its breath. I barely slept the night before. I'd spent hours going over every document, every email, every number, making sure nothing could be twisted against me. My allies, the forensic accountant, Carla, and the supplier's rep, Marcus, were scheduled to arrive early. We agreed to keep the meeting under my control, to not let Mom and Daniel dictate the narrative this time. I walked into the building earlier than usual, and the familiar scent of polished floors and stale coffee hit me like a weight. This place used to feel like home, the core of everything my family and I had built. Now it felt like a cage. Mom was already there, sitting at the head of the long conference table with Daniel on her left. They both looked sharp, of course, dresses and suits impeccable, but the look in their eyes was colder than ever, calculating and impatient. As I entered, Mom's eyes flicked up briefly, then she gave a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Alex," she said, voice calm but heavy with meaning. "Glad you could join us." Daniel barely looked up. "We were wondering if you'd show." The lawyers took their seats, papers shuffled, phones were muted. Carla and Marcus arrived right after me, quietly settling in next to me. I could feel the room tense like a drawn bow. Mom started the meeting with a statement that set the tone. "We're here to discuss the future of the company, a future that requires unity, stability, and trust. Alex has made his position very clear, but his continued resistance is putting us all at risk." She cast a glance at Daniel, who smirked and nodded. I stood slowly and in my calmest voice said, "Then let's talk about trust, shall we? Because from what I've gathered, trust is the one thing Mom and Daniel seem to have broken repeatedly." There was a flicker of surprise on Mom's face, but she recovered quickly. I pulled out a binder and began laying out the evidence I collected over the past months. I showed the inflated invoices, the fraudulent vendor contracts, the financial transactions Daniel had tried to hide, and the forged documents attempting to frame me for theft. Carla walked the board through the forensic accountant's findings with precise clarity, cutting through the legal jargon and family noise. Marcus presented testimony about how Daniel's actions had directly harmed the supplier relationships and the company's reputation. Mom's calm veneer was slipping. "You're twisting facts," she snapped, but her voice was no longer commanding, more defensive. "These documents were taken out of context. Daniel has always acted in the company's best interests." Daniel leaned forward, voice rising. "This is a smear campaign. Alex is trying to ruin us." I stayed silent, letting their anger fill the room while I calmly added the last piece to the puzzle. A contract signed by Daniel for a vendor that didn't exist, with the payments funneled to an account registered in his name. The room was quiet except for the soft rustle of papers. The lawyers exchanged glances, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. One of the senior board members, an old family friend who'd stayed neutral until now, cleared his throat. "Alex, this is serious. If these allegations are true, Daniel's conduct could be considered fraud. Mom's face paled for a moment, but then she scoffed. Fraud? That's an exaggeration. Daniel made mistakes, nothing more. And as for Alex, his so-called investigation has disrupted the business and damaged morale. I looked around the room, noting who was beginning to doubt Mom's iron grip on the company. That's exactly why I refused to hand over my shares. Because if this keeps happening, the company won't last another year. And that will be on Mom and Daniel's heads. Mom's expression twisted with fury, and Daniel suddenly slammed his fist on the table. You think you're some hero? You're just a greedy opportunist trying to steal what isn't yours. At that moment, Carla stepped forward with something else. We also found evidence of efforts to intimidate and threaten employees to silence any dissent. Heads turned sharply toward Daniel, whose smirk had vanished. I revealed emails and messages between Daniel and several key employees, pressuring them to support his version of events or risk losing their jobs. One by one, board members shifted in their seats. The facade Mom and Daniel had maintained for decades was cracking, but I wasn't done yet. I pulled out a final document, a letter from the bank outlining suspicious activity tied to Daniel, including attempts to freeze my personal accounts and liens filed without justification. You tried to ruin me financially, I said, voice steady. That's illegal. And now, it's on record. Mom's voice dropped to a whisper. You don't know what you're doing. I smiled. On the contrary, I do. And I brought a few guests who have other plans. At that moment, two more people entered the room, the bank's legal counsel and a representative from the regulatory body overseeing financial compliance. The room fell silent again. The bank's counsel laid out the irregularities in detail, explaining that a full investigation was underway. The compliance rep added that such actions could result in criminal charges. Mom's face was pale, lips pressed thin. Daniel looked like he might bolt. Then came the most satisfying moment, the final blow. I stood and said, I refuse to let this family business be destroyed by greed and corruption. I am here to protect its legacy, even if that means taking every step necessary. The room stayed quiet, the weight of what had just been revealed hanging heavy. But then, without warning, Mom's expression shifted from shock to something darker, a cold, almost predatory look. She said, You may have won this round, Alex, but you've just declared war, and I don't lose. Daniel nodded, voice low but deadly. This isn't over. After that intense board meeting, things spiraled quickly. Mom and Daniel tried every tactic they could muster, threats, legal maneuvers, even attempts to manipulate some of the smaller shareholders. But the tide had turned. With the evidence firmly in hand and the bank and regulatory bodies now watching closely, their position was no longer unshakable. The first blow came within weeks. The Financial Regulatory Agency launched a formal investigation into Daniel's actions, freezing his access to company accounts and suspending his role on the board pending the outcome. That same day, Mom's closest allies in the company started quietly distancing themselves. The whispers of her involvement in covering for Daniel's fraud began to circulate, and shareholders grew restless. Meanwhile, I worked closely with Carla and Marcus to restructure the company's leadership. We introduced stricter oversight measures and transparent accounting practices. Morale among employees, which had been plummeting under Daniel's bullying, began to improve. Mom's attempts to intimidate me at home or outside business hours became less frequent, replaced by icy silences and avoidance. Family gatherings became a battlefield of passive-aggressive comments and barely concealed resentment. Daniel, stripped of power and publicly disgraced, spiraled into bitterness. He tried to rally supporters for a hostile takeover, but the legal bindings and his damaged reputation made that impossible. Eventually, the company's shareholders voted to buy out Mom and Daniel's shares. They reluctantly agreed, knowing the writing was on the wall. The family business, once a symbol of their control, was now under a new era, one built on integrity, accountability, and respect. As for Mom and Daniel, their reputations in the community were irreparably damaged. The local press reported on the scandal extensively, making clear the roles they played in jeopardizing the business for personal greed. Invitations to community events stopped arriving. Even distant relatives began to quietly sever ties. Personally, I felt a complicated mix of relief and sadness. This was never how I wanted things to end, but after years of manipulation and betrayal, there was no room left for forgiveness. I kept my shares and took on a leadership role, determined to rebuild the company into something truly worthy of the family name, a legacy of hard work, honesty, and fairness. The day I officially took the helm, I looked out over the office filled with employees who had stood by me through everything. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that, despite everything, I had prevailed not through ruthlessness but through perseverance and truth. Mom and Daniel's attempts to pressure and control me had only made me stronger. The family business was mine to protect now, and I wasn't going to let anyone ruin it again. So, that's where things stand. The battle is over, but the scars remain. Sometimes, I still get messages from former allies of Mom and Daniel, bitter and angry. But I've learned to keep my focus on the future and on building something better from the ashes of their betrayal. If there's one thing this whole ordeal taught me, it's this. No matter how deep the betrayal or how high the stakes, standing firm on what's right will always be worth it. And sometimes, the most important victory isn't just winning the fight. It's proving you're nothing like the villains who tried to take everything from you. Thanks for reading. If you're dealing with toxic family or business battles, know you're not alone. And sometimes the hardest fights bring the clearest victories. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.